Picture this. You're sitting inside one of the most beautiful wedding venues in the city. Crystal chandeliers hang from the ceiling like frozen stars. Sunlight pours through tall cathedral windows, catching the sparkle of diamond jewelry and champagne glasses held by some of the wealthiest guests in attendance. The ceremony has already begun. At the end of the long white aisle stands the groom, Daniel Carter. Tall, impeccably dressed in a perfectly tailored black tuxedo. Calm, confident. The kind of man who looks like he has never doubted a single decision in his life. His friends clap him on the back. His business partners nod approvingly. To them, this wedding isn't just a romantic milestone, it's the union of two respectable families, two stable futures. And today, Daniel looks like a man who has everything exactly where he wants it. Then the music changes. Soft violin notes begin to float through the room as everyone slowly rises from their seats. Because the bride has arrived. Emma Whitmore appears at the entrance of the aisle, her white gown flowing behind her like a cloud of silk. The delicate lace sleeves catch the light with every step she takes. Her father stands proudly beside her, his arm steady beneath hers as they begin walking forward. Every eye in the room follows her. Guests smile. Cameras flash. Daniel's expression softens the moment he sees her. From the outside, it looks like the beginning of a perfect life. But if you looked closely, really closely, you might notice the way Emma's fingers tighten slightly around her bouquet. The way her smile looks just a little rehearsed. Because while everyone in this room believes this is the happiest day of her life, Emma knows something they don't, and she's been carrying it for years. Halfway down the aisle, just as the officiant prepares to begin the vows, the massive wooden doors at the back of the hall burst open. The sound echoes through the cathedral-like room. Every head turns. The music falters. A man steps inside. Not a late guest. Not a confused stranger. Him. Emma's ex. Lucas Hayes. He stands in the doorway for a moment, slightly out of breath, as if he had rushed to get here before something important ended. The sunlight from outside frames him like a spotlight as whispers ripple through the crowd. Some guests recognize him. Some don't. But Emma does. And the moment her eyes meet his, she stops walking. Completely. Because Lucas isn't empty-handed. Clutched tightly in his fingers is a small sealed envelope. A letter. One Emma hasn't seen in years. One she wrote on the night she disappeared from his life without explanation. Lucas slowly starts walking down the aisle toward the altar. Toward her. The murmuring in the room grows louder. Daniel's confident expression begins to fade as he turns toward Emma, confusion creeping into his voice when he asks the obvious question. Emma, do you know this man? She doesn't answer right away. Because the truth is, that letter Lucas is holding was written years ago. And inside it is a truth Emma has never told anyone. Not her fiancé. Not her family. Not even the man holding the letter himself. Which means the man she was about to marry believes her past is over. But the truth walking down that aisle is about to rewrite everything. From the outside, Emma Whitmore's life looked flawless. Anyone attending the wedding that afternoon would have believed they were witnessing the perfect union, one of those elegant ceremonies people talk about for years afterward. The venue alone made sure of that. The wedding was being held at the Grand Regent Ballroom, one of the most exclusive event spaces in the city. A place usually reserved for charity galas, corporate celebrations, and the occasional celebrity wedding. The ceiling arched high above the guests, painted with delicate gold detailing that shimmered beneath rows of crystal chandeliers. Long tables draped in ivory silk lined the room. Every place setting had been carefully arranged with polished silverware and imported porcelain plates. Tall arrangements of white roses and orchids stood in the center of each table like sculptures. This wasn't just a wedding. It was a statement. And the man behind it all stood waiting confidently at the altar. Daniel Carter. Even among the city's wealthiest guests, Daniel stood out. Not just because of the perfectly fitted tuxedo or the understated luxury of his gold cufflinks, but because of the reputation that followed him everywhere. By 35, Daniel had already built one of the fastest-growing financial consulting firms in the region. His company handled portfolios for major investors, real estate developers, and tech entrepreneurs. People trusted him with millions. Some even trusted him with their futures. He was the kind of man newspapers described as disciplined, strategic, and reliable. The kind of man parents hoped their daughters would marry. Which was exactly why nearly everyone in the room believed Emma Whitmore had just won the lottery. Daniel had stability. He had influence. He had money. And more importantly, he had the calm, steady confidence of a man who always seemed to know what he was doing. When Emma first met him 2 years ago at a charity fundraiser, many of her friends had quietly celebrated for her. Finally, they said, she had chosen someone who could give her a real future. Someone dependable. Someone safe. Standing at the altar now, Daniel looked exactly like a man stepping into the next carefully planned chapter of his life. He glanced toward the entrance of the aisle where Emma had appeared moments earlier, and a small smile touched his lips. To him, everything was unfolding exactly as it should. But if anyone had looked closely at the bride walking toward him, they might have noticed something unusual. Emma's smile never quite reached her eyes. She walked gracefully, her white dress flowing behind her with every step, but there was something mechanical about the way she moved. Something practiced. As if she had rehearsed this moment too many times. The bouquet in her hands trembled slightly. Not enough for most people to notice, but enough for her to feel it. Because Emma Whitmore had spent the past 6 months preparing for this wedding with almost surgical precision. The venue, the flowers, the guest list, the dress. Every detail had been carefully chosen. But there had been another preparation too. Every morning, standing in front of the bathroom mirror, she practiced smiling. Just like this. Just enough warmth in her eyes. Just enough softness around her mouth. A smile that said she was happy. A smile that said she belonged here. And most days, she almost believed it herself. Daniel had given her something her life had lacked for a long time. Peace. Predictability. A future that didn't feel like it could collapse overnight. That mattered more than people realized. Love, Emma had learned, wasn't always enough to build a life on. Sometimes stability mattered more. Sometimes choosing the right person meant choosing the person who would never let everything fall apart. And Daniel Carter would never let things fall apart. He was the kind of man who built systems to prevent failure, which was exactly why Emma had chosen him. At least, that was what she kept telling herself. Because deep down, beneath the layers of careful logic and polite smiles, there was a small voice she tried very hard not to listen to. A voice that whispered something uncomfortable every time she looked in the mirror. This isn't the life you dreamed about. But Emma had spent years learning how to silence that voice. Until today. Until the moment the doors opened. Until the past she had buried walked back into her life. Years before Daniel Carter ever appeared in Emma's life, there had been someone else. Someone who knew a version of her that none of these guests had ever met. Lucas Hayes. Emma first met Lucas during their second year at university. He wasn't the type of man people described as stable. In fact, stability was probably the last word anyone would have used. Lucas had messy dark hair that never stayed in place, a habit of talking too fast when he was excited, and a constant energy that made it seem like his brain was always running 2 steps ahead of everyone else. But what he lacked in order, he made up for in passion. Lucas believed in ideas. Big ones. The kind that kept him awake at 3 in the morning scribbling plans into notebooks and sketching business models on whiteboards. He wanted to build things. Companies. Technology. Solutions that didn't exist yet. And when he talked about those ideas, His eyes lit up in a way that made it impossible not to listen. Emma had been studying marketing at the time, focused and practical in ways Lucas wasn't. Where he saw possibilities, she saw structure. Where he chased dreams, she figured out how those dreams might actually survive in the real world. They balanced each other. At first, their relationship was built on little things. Late-night study sessions that turned into long conversations about the future. Cheap coffee from the campus cafe. Shared headphones on bus rides across town. Neither of them had much money. Lucas worked part-time repairing laptops for students. Emma worked evenings at a bookstore. Their dates were usually simple. Takeout noodles eaten on the floor of Lucas's tiny apartment. Movies streamed on a laptop because neither of them could afford a television. But somehow, those small moments felt bigger than anything else. Because back then, they believed something powerful. That if two people worked hard enough and loved each other enough, they could build a life from nothing. Lucas used to say it all the time. "Give me 5 years," he would tell her with a grin. 5 years and I'll build something incredible. Emma always believed him, not because the plan was perfect, but because Lucas believed it so fiercely. They talked about the future constantly. A house one day. Maybe kids. A company Lucas would run while Emma handled the business strategy. They were young enough to believe the timeline would unfold exactly as they imagined. But dreams, Emma eventually learned, didn't always follow a schedule. And love. Love didn't always pay the rent. The first year after university was the hardest. Lucas graduated with a degree in computer engineering and immediately threw himself into building a tech startup with 2 of his classmates. The idea was ambitious. A platform that could predict market trends using artificial intelligence. Lucas was convinced it would change everything. But building a company required money. And money was something they didn't have. For months, Lucas worked nearly every waking hour trying to bring the idea to life. He coded through the night, attended pitch meetings during the day, and survived mostly on cheap takeout and caffeine. Emma watched it all happen from the sidelines. At first, she admired his dedication. But gradually the pressure began to grow. Because while Lucas chased investors and built prototypes, Emma was the one paying the bills. Her marketing job paid modestly, but it was steady. Steady enough to cover their small apartment. Steady enough to keep the lights on. Steady enough to buy groceries. Months passed. Then a year. The startup struggled to gain traction. Investors lost interest. Lucas refused to give up. But the strain was beginning to show. Arguments started over small things. Money. Time. Exhaustion. Lucas would promise things would change soon. Emma wanted to believe him, but belief was getting harder every day. Then came the meeting that changed everything. Lucas and his partners pitched their company to a major venture capital firm. It was supposed to be their breakthrough moment. Instead, it was a disaster. The investors rejected them within 20 minutes. Lucas came home that night looking like someone had pulled the ground out from beneath him. For the first time since Emma had known him, he seemed uncertain. Lost. The next few weeks were worse. The company slowly collapsed. His partners began searching for regular jobs. Lucas tried to keep the project alive, but the momentum was gone. And the weight of the failure settled heavily between them. Emma felt something inside her begin to shift. She still loved him, but love alone suddenly felt fragile. Unpredictable. One night, after another quiet dinner eaten in tense silence, Emma packed a suitcase. Lucas was working late at the office. She didn't wait for him to come home. Instead, she left a letter on the kitchen table. Then she walked out of the apartment they had once believed would be the beginning of everything. Lucas came home hours later to an empty room. And the letter she had left behind. He never opened it. For years, Lucas believed Emma had left because he failed. Because he couldn't give her the stable future she deserved. Because loving him meant choosing uncertainty. But the real reason Emma walked away that night, was far more complicated. Leaving Lucas had been the hardest decision Emma Whitmore had ever made. Not because she stopped loving him, but because she knew she never would. The morning after she walked out of their tiny apartment, Emma woke up in a cheap hotel room on the other side of the city with a feeling she had never experienced before. Silence. No laptop keyboards clicking at 3 in the morning. No half-finished business plans scattered across the kitchen table. No Lucas pacing around the room excitedly explaining some new idea he believed could change the world. Just quiet. At first, the quiet felt unbearable. Emma kept expecting her phone to ring. Lucas calling. Lucas asking where she was. Lucas demanding an explanation. But the call never came. Days turned into weeks. Weeks turned into months. Emma buried herself in work. Her marketing job slowly turned into a career she could rely on. She stayed late, volunteered for extra projects, and pushed herself harder than she ever had before. Because staying busy meant she didn't have to think. Didn't have to wonder what Lucas was doing. Didn't have to imagine him opening the letter she left behind. Eventually, life began to settle into something predictable. And predictable was comforting. The chaos that had once surrounded her relationship with Lucas faded into memory. Bills were paid on time. Weekends were quiet. Life stopped feeling like a constant gamble. It was during one of those quiet, carefully structured months that Emma met Daniel Carter. The event was a charity fundraiser hosted by a major business foundation. Emma's company had sponsored part of the evening, and she had been asked to attend as part of the marketing team. She almost didn't go. But her boss insisted. Networking matters, he told her. That night, Emma stood near the bar holding a glass of sparkling water and trying to look interested in conversations about investment portfolios and market forecasts. That's when Daniel approached her. He wasn't flashy. He didn't dominate the room the way some of the other executives did. Instead, Daniel carried himself with quiet confidence, the kind that didn't need attention to feel powerful. Their conversation started simply. Work. The event. The organization hosting the fundraiser. Daniel asked thoughtful questions and actually listened to the answers. Emma found herself relaxing in a way she hadn't expected. There was something calming about him. No urgency. No emotional intensity. Just steady presence. Over the next few weeks, Daniel asked her to dinner. Then another. Then another. The restaurants he chose were elegant but understated. Their conversations were easy. Daniel spoke about long-term goals, about building stability, about planning a future that made sense. And slowly, Emma began to realize something. Daniel represented everything Lucas had not. Security. Consistency. A life that didn't feel like it might collapse overnight. When Daniel talked about the future, it wasn't filled with wild possibilities. It was filled with certainty. That certainty felt safe. And after everything Emma had gone through, safety was something she desperately wanted. Their relationship grew gradually. There were no dramatic emotional moments. No late-night arguments about dreams. No unpredictable ups and downs. Just steady progress. Dinner dates turned into weekend trips. Weekend trips turned into meeting each other's families. Eventually Daniel asked her a simple question one evening while they were walking along the river after dinner. Do you see a future with me? Emma paused. And then she said yes. Not because her heart raced the way it once had with Lucas, but because with Daniel, she could finally imagine a life that wouldn't fall apart. And for a long time, that felt like enough. The night Emma left, Lucas Hayes didn't sleep. He sat in the small apartment they had shared, staring at the letter she left behind on the kitchen table. The envelope had his name written on it in Emma's handwriting. Simple. Direct. Lucas turned it over in his hands several times. He knew what it probably contained. An explanation. A goodbye. Maybe even an apology. But for reasons he couldn't fully explain, Lucas never opened it. Instead, he slipped the envelope into a drawer in his desk. Then he did the only thing he knew how to do when life felt like it was collapsing around him. He worked. Lucas threw himself back into the startup with a level of intensity that worried even the friends who had built the company with him. If Emma believed he wasn't capable of success, he would prove her wrong. If she believed his dreams were impossible, he would turn them into reality. At least that's what he told himself. But the truth was more complicated. Lucas wasn't just chasing success. He was running from the silence Emma had left behind. The company barely survived its first year. Two of his co-founders eventually left to pursue stable careers elsewhere. Investors declined meeting requests. Money ran dangerously low. But Lucas refused to quit. He rewrote the product, changed the business model, spent nights sleeping on the office couch when rent became difficult to afford. Slowly, painfully, the idea began to evolve. The predictive AI system he had once imagined as a financial tool started attracting attention from other industries. Logistics companies, retail corporations, even government agencies. They all wanted technology that could predict patterns and future outcomes. And Lucas had built something surprisingly powerful. By the time 5 years had passed, the startup that once struggled to survive had transformed into one of the fastest-growing data analytics companies in the tech sector. Lucas Hayes became the CEO of a company valued at hundreds of millions of dollars. Investors who once ignored his emails now competed for meetings. Industry magazines called him a visionary. But despite the success, there was one thing Lucas never changed. In the top drawer of his office desk sat a sealed envelope. Emma's letter. He carried it with him through every office move, every apartment, every milestone. Lucas never opened it, because in some strange way, leaving it sealed allowed him to keep one possibility alive. If he never read the words inside, then maybe the reason Emma left wasn't as simple as failure. Maybe there had been something else. Something he didn't understand yet. And until he knew for certain, Lucas couldn't bring himself to destroy the last connection he still had to her. So the letter remained closed. A mystery he carried quietly through the years. The email arrived on a Tuesday afternoon. Lucas almost ignored it. His inbox was filled with dozens of messages every day. Investor updates, partnership proposals, media requests. But something about the subject line made him pause. It was simple. Just 2 words. From Emma. Lucas stared at the screen for several seconds before opening the message. For a moment, the office around him disappeared. The polished glass walls. The quiet hum of employees working outside. The success he had spent years building. None of it mattered. Because Emma Whitmore hadn't contacted him once since the day she left. Until now. His hand hovered over the mouse before he finally clicked the message open. The email itself was short. Shockingly short. There was no greeting. No explanation. Just a few lines. Lucas, I'm getting married in 3 weeks. The ceremony will be held at the Grand Regent Ballroom. Please come. Lucas leaned back slowly in his chair. The words felt strangely unreal. Emma was getting married. The thought hit him harder than he expected. He had known logically that she would move on eventually. People always did. But seeing it written so plainly made the reality impossible to ignore. Lucas continued reading. There was one more line at the bottom of the message. And please bring the letter. Lucas frowned. The letter. For a moment he didn't move. Then he stood up and crossed the office to the small cabinet where he kept personal belongings. Opening the top drawer, he reached inside and pulled out the envelope that had remained sealed for years. Emma's handwriting looked exactly the same. Careful. Deliberate. Lucas turned the envelope over slowly. Why would she want this now? Why ask him to bring it to her wedding? The request made no sense. For the rest of the day, Lucas tried to focus on work. But the message stayed in the back of his mind. That evening, he sat alone in his apartment holding the letter again. He considered opening it. After all, Emma was getting married. Whatever answers the letter contained probably didn't matter anymore. But something stopped him. Instead, Lucas found himself replaying the years since she left. Everything that had changed. Everything he had built. And yet somehow, one message from her had managed to shake something loose inside him. A question he had never fully resolved. Why had she really left? Not the explanation he had always assumed. The real reason. Lucas looked at the email again. 3 weeks. The wedding was 3 weeks away. He could ignore the invitation. Delete the message. Pretend it never arrived. But Emma had asked for something very specific. Bring the letter. Which meant she knew he still had it. The realization made Lucas uneasy. How could she know that? Unless she believed he had never opened it. Lucas stared at the envelope for a long time, then finally placed it back in the drawer. He would think about it tomorrow. The next day he thought about it again. And the day after that. Curiosity slowly began to replace hesitation. If Emma wanted the letter returned, she could have asked for it any time over the past 7 years. Why now? Why at her wedding? After nearly a week of debating with himself, Lucas made a decision. He would go. Not because he wanted to see her marry someone else, but because he needed to understand something that had never made sense. So 3 weeks later, Lucas Hayes walked into the Grand Regent Ballroom with a sealed envelope in his hand. He believed he was simply attending a wedding, but he had no idea he was walking into the most important moment of Emma's life. By the time the ceremony began, the Grand Regent Ballroom looked less like an event hall and more like a carefully constructed dream. Soft violin music floated through the air as guests slowly filled the rows of white chairs arranged along the central aisle. Each seat had been meticulously placed to create the perfect symmetry for the ceremony. Everything about the room reflected quiet luxury. Tall glass windows allowed the afternoon sunlight to pour in, catching the gold accents along the walls and sending warm reflections across the polished marble floor. White orchids hung from delicate crystal stands, forming a path down the aisle that led to the raised altar at the front of the room. The guest list alone made the wedding one of the most talked-about social events of the season. Several of Daniel Carter's investors had flown in from different cities. There were CEOs of financial firms, real estate developers, technology executives, and respected figures from the city's business community. Conversations buzzed quietly throughout the hall as people exchanged handshakes and polite greetings. Near the front rows sat Emma's family. Her parents looked proud, though slightly overwhelmed by the scale of the event. Her younger sister whispered excitedly with cousins seated nearby, pointing occasionally toward the elegant decorations. To everyone present, this wedding symbolized success. 2 accomplished people building a powerful future together. At the front of the room stood Daniel. Calm. Composed. Exactly the way he appeared in boardrooms and investor meetings. His tuxedo was perfectly tailored, and his posture reflected the quiet confidence that had built his reputation over the years. If he felt nervous, he didn't show it. Daniel Carter was a man who rarely lost control of a situation. The music shifted slightly as the ceremony coordinator signaled the start. Guests slowly turned toward the large double doors at the back of the room. The doors opened. Emma stepped inside. A soft murmur passed through the crowd. She looked breathtaking. Her wedding dress flowed gracefully across the marble floor as she began walking down the aisle. The design was elegant rather than extravagant, layers of white silk that shimmered under the soft lighting. A delicate veil rested over her shoulders. Her bouquet of white roses was held gently in both hands. From the outside, Emma appeared calm, but inside, her thoughts were moving in chaotic circles. She had imagined this moment many times over the past months, walking toward Daniel, starting a new life built on certainty, a life where the past would finally stay where it belonged. Behind her, Emma took another step down the aisle, then another. Halfway to the altar, something changed. It started as a subtle shift in the atmosphere, a slight disturbance among the guests seated near the back. Emma's eyes instinctively moved in that direction, and that's when she saw him, Lucas Hayes, standing near the entrance. For a brief second, everything inside Emma seemed to freeze. Her heart stopped. The years that had passed since she last saw him suddenly collapsed into a single overwhelming moment. Lucas looked different, older, more composed. The restless energy she remembered from their university years had been replaced by something steadier. But it was unmistakably him. Emma's breath caught in her throat. She had asked him to come. She knew he might. But actually seeing him there made the reality far more intense than she had prepared for. Lucas stood quietly at the back of the room, his dark suit blending into the formal crowd around him. In his hand was something small. An envelope. Emma recognized it instantly, even from across the room. The letter. The same letter she had written the night she left. For a moment, her steps slowed. Daniel noticed immediately. From his position at the altar, he had been watching Emma walk toward him with the calm focus he applied to everything in life. But now something about her movement had changed. Just slightly. Enough for him to notice. Her smile had faded. Her eyes were no longer fixed on him. Instead, they were looking past him, toward the back of the room. Daniel followed her gaze, and saw Lucas. He didn't know who the man was, but he could feel the tension ripple through the moment. Emma resumed walking, but something had shifted inside the room. Guests sensed it. The subtle energy that passes through a crowd when something unexpected begins to unfold. Emma reached the altar. She stood beside Daniel. The music faded. The officiant smiled warmly and began speaking. But Emma barely heard the words, because she could feel Lucas standing somewhere behind her, holding the one thing she had never wanted him to read. The ceremony moved forward with careful elegance. The officiant spoke about love, commitment, and the meaning of partnership. Guests listened politely as the traditional words echoed through the ballroom. But the tension in the room had grown impossible to ignore. Emma could feel it. Daniel could feel it. Even the guests sensed something slightly unusual in the air. Lucas remained near the back of the room, watching, waiting. The envelope still rested quietly in his hand. Emma kept her eyes forward, focusing on the officiant's voice and the familiar rhythm of the ceremony. But every second felt heavier than the one before. Eventually, the moment arrived when the officiant asked the couple to step forward. "Before we proceed with the vows," the officiant said gently, "is there anyone present who wishes to speak?" The sentence never finished, because someone began walking forward. The sound of footsteps echoed softly across the marble floor. Guests turned in their seats. Whispers spread quickly through the room. Lucas was moving down the aisle. Slowly, deliberately. Emma closed her eyes for a brief second. The moment she had feared was here. Lucas stopped a few steps away from the altar. He didn't look angry. He didn't look emotional. He simply looked calm. Daniel watched the man approach, confusion slowly forming behind his composed expression. Lucas glanced briefly at Emma. Then he lifted the envelope slightly. His voice, when he spoke, was quiet but clear enough for the entire room to hear.
"You asked me to bring this."
A ripple of murmurs spread through the guests. People leaned toward one another, whispering questions. Who was he? What was happening? Why was he interrupting the ceremony? Emma kept her eyes closed for another second before finally opening them. The envelope looked exactly the same. 7 years. 7 years since she had written those words. 7 years hoping Lucas would never read them. But now the letter had returned. In front of everyone, Daniel looked from Lucas to Emma, trying to understand what was unfolding. The carefully controlled environment he had created for this wedding was beginning to fracture. And he didn't like uncertainty. Not here. Not today. The officiant stood frozen, unsure whether to continue or remain silent. Lucas said nothing else. He simply held the envelope out slightly. Waiting. Emma's heart pounded painfully in her chest, because she knew something the rest of the room did not. Once the letter entered the conversation, everything would change. For several seconds, no one moved. The entire ballroom seemed suspended in a strange, fragile silence. Lucas stood calmly at the base of the altar steps, the envelope still in his hand. Emma felt every eye in the room shifting between them. Daniel finally spoke. His voice was measured, but the confusion beneath it was impossible to hide. Emma! He turned toward her slightly. Do you know this man? The question hung heavily in the air. Emma's hands tightened around her bouquet. There was no point pretending, no way to escape the truth now. Slowly, she nodded. A wave of whispers passed through the guests. Daniel's eyes narrowed slightly as he looked again at Lucas. Who is he? Emma swallowed. Her voice, when she finally spoke, was quiet. My past. The words made the tension in the room grow even stronger. Daniel studied Lucas carefully. There was something about the man's posture that made him uneasy. Lucas didn't look like someone trying to cause a scene. He wasn't shouting. He wasn't emotional. He simply looked like someone fulfilling a request. And that somehow made the moment even stranger. Daniel glanced down at the envelope. Why is he holding a letter? Emma hesitated, because explaining the truth meant revealing something she had hidden for years. Lucas spoke before she could answer. She asked me to bring it. Daniel's attention snapped back toward Emma. You asked him. Emma nodded again. More whispers. Confusion rippled through the crowd. Emma's parents exchanged worried glances in the front row. Daniel's investors leaned toward each other quietly. No one understood what was happening. Daniel took a slow breath, trying to maintain control of the situation. He stepped slightly closer to Emma. Would you like to explain? Emma looked out across the room. All the faces, all the expectations, all the carefully constructed stability she had built with Daniel. And standing just a few feet away, Lucas, holding the one piece of the past she had never escaped. Emma's heart pounded as she realized something terrifying. This moment would decide everything. Her future, her marriage, her truth. Lucas gently lifted the envelope again. You wanted it back, he said quietly. Emma stared at it. For 7 years she had wondered whether Lucas opened it, whether he hated her, whether he understood. Now she knew. He had never read it, which meant the truth inside still had the power to change everything. Daniel followed Emma's gaze to the envelope. His voice lowered slightly. What's in that letter? Emma inhaled slowly. The entire room waited, and when she finally spoke, her voice carried across the silent ballroom.
There's a reason I left Lucas.
The guests leaned forward slightly. Emma looked from Daniel to Lucas, then back at the crowd. Her next words would change the entire wedding and stop the ceremony completely, because the truth Emma was about to reveal was something no one in the room expected to hear. The ballroom was so quiet that even the soft rustle of Emma's dress seemed loud. Hundreds of eyes were fixed on the envelope in Lucas's hand. 7 years. 7 years that letter had remained sealed. 7 years that its words had stayed hidden between folded paper. Lucas stared at the envelope for a moment, his thumb running slowly along the edge. For years he had imagined what might be written inside. An apology. A goodbye. Maybe even a confession that she simply stopped loving him. But now the truth was about to be revealed in front of an entire room. Lucas looked up at Emma. Her expression was calm on the surface, but he could see the tension in her shoulders. She wasn't afraid of him. She was afraid of the truth. "Open it," Emma said softly. The words echoed across the silent ballroom. Lucas nodded once. Carefully, he slid a finger under the flap and opened the envelope. The simple tearing sound cut through the quiet like a blade. Inside was a folded sheet of paper. The handwriting was exactly as he remembered, Emma's neat, careful script. Lucas unfolded the letter slowly. His eyes moved across the first line. For a moment he didn't speak. Then he began reading aloud. "Lucas, by the time you read this, I'll already be gone." The guests remained completely silent. Lucas continued. "I know you'll probably think I'm leaving because the startup failed, or because life with you became too hard. But that isn't the truth." Lucas paused briefly. His chest tightened. He kept reading. "I'm leaving because something happened today that changed everything. This morning I went to the doctor. And I found out I'm pregnant." A collective gasp spread through the ballroom. Lucas stopped reading. His eyes snapped up toward Emma in shock. "Pregnant?" Emma stood perfectly still at the altar. Her hands were trembling slightly. Lucas looked back down at the letter. His voice became quieter as he continued reading. "I know what you're going to say if you find out. You'll say we can handle it. You'll say we'll figure it out together. But, Lucas, I've watched how hard you're already fighting just to keep your dream alive. You're carrying the weight of a failing company, of expectations, of pressure. And now this." Lucas swallowed. The words were beginning to hit him harder with every line. "I can't be the reason you give up your dream. I can't watch you sacrifice everything you've worked for because we're about to have a baby. And I can't raise a child in a life built on constant uncertainty. So I'm leaving. Not because I don't love you, but because I love you enough to step out of the way." Lucas's voice trembled slightly as he read the final part. "I know you'll hate me for this, but maybe one day you'll understand why I made this choice. And maybe one day you'll build the future you always believed in, without having to carry me, or this child, as another burden." Lucas stopped reading. The room remained frozen. He slowly lowered the letter. His mind struggled to process what he had just read. All those years, all those assumptions, all the anger he had buried deep inside himself. Emma hadn't left because he failed. She left because she thought staying would destroy his future. Lucas looked up again. "Emma," he whispered. But the story wasn't finished yet. Emma took a slow step forward. The room watched her carefully now. The elegant bride who had entered the ballroom earlier no longer looked like someone celebrating a wedding. She looked like someone finally releasing years of silence. "Yes," Emma said quietly. "I was pregnant." The words hung in the air. Lucas stared at her, still gripping the letter in his hand. "You never told me," he said. Emma nodded.
I couldn't.
Lucas shook his head slowly.
You should have trusted me with that.
Emma's expression softened.
I did trust you.
Her voice trembled slightly now. That's exactly why I left. The room remained silent as Emma continued speaking. When I found out I was pregnant, Lucas was already barely sleeping. His company was collapsing. Investors were pulling out. Every day he came home exhausted but still trying to convince himself he could fix everything. She looked toward Lucas again.
You were already carrying too much.
Lucas opened his mouth as if to argue, but Emma raised her hand gently. I know what you would have done if you found out, she said.
You would have dropped everything.
You would have taken a job you didn't want. You would have given up the company. You would have buried your dream just to make sure we were safe. Lucas didn't respond. Because she was right. Emma continued.
And I couldn't live with that.
She took another slow breath.
So I left.
The guests remained completely still. Some people had begun exchanging shocked glances.
Daniel stood quietly beside Emma, his expression unreadable.
But Emma hadn't finished yet. Her voice grew softer.
3 weeks after I left.
She paused. For the first time, the strength in her posture wavered. I lost the baby. A quiet wave of murmurs passed through the crowd. Lucas's face drained of color. Emma looked down briefly at the floor before continuing. The doctor said it was caused by stress. Everything that happened, the move, the emotional pressure. Her hands tightened around the bouquet again.
I went through it alone.
Lucas stared at her in disbelief.
You should have called me.
Emma shook her head gently.
No.
If I told you what happened, you would have blamed yourself. Lucas's jaw tightened.
Of course I would have.
Emma gave a small, sad smile. That's exactly why I didn't. She looked across the room at the hundreds of faces watching her. For years I wondered if I made the right choice. If leaving actually helped you.
Lucas lowered his eyes briefly.
Emma's voice softened again. When I saw the news about your company, when I read about your success, I told myself maybe the sacrifice meant something. Lucas said nothing, because the truth was unbearable. Everything he built had been fueled by anger, by heartbreak, by the belief that Emma abandoned him because he failed. But the real reason had been the opposite. She left because she believed in him too much. The ballroom felt different now. What began as a celebration had transformed into something far more intimate. A room full of strangers had just witnessed the unraveling of 7 years of silence. Emma turned slowly toward Daniel. He had listened to everything without interrupting. His expression remained calm, but the weight of the story was impossible to ignore. Emma spoke carefully. Daniel, I'm sorry. Daniel's voice remained steady.
For what? For not telling you sooner.
He studied her for a moment.
You never mentioned Lucas.
Emma nodded.
I know.
Daniel glanced briefly at Lucas, then back at Emma.
And the letter?
Emma exhaled slowly. I invited Lucas here because I couldn't start a marriage built on secrets. The room remained completely still as she continued. I've spent 7 years carrying this alone. The pregnancy, the miscarriage,
the lie Lucas believed about why I left.
Emma's eyes glistened slightly now. And I realized something while planning this wedding. If I walked down this aisle without telling the truth, I would be building a new life on the same silence that destroyed the last one. She looked directly at Daniel.
You deserve honesty.
Then she turned toward Lucas.
And so do you.
Lucas still held the letter in his hands. The paper trembled slightly. Emma's voice softened further.
I didn't invite you to stop the wedding.
I invited you because you deserved to finally know the truth. She paused.
And because I needed closure.
The word echoed quietly through the ballroom. Closure. 7 years of unfinished emotions contained in a single word. Emma looked down briefly before lifting her eyes again. For the first time since I left, everything is finally out in the open. The officiant, who had remained silent through the entire revelation, stepped forward cautiously. The ceremony had been paused for nearly 20 minutes. Guests were still trying to process what they had just heard. The officiant cleared his throat gently, then asked the question that now carried far more weight than before. Emma! His voice was careful. Do you still wish to continue this ceremony? The entire ballroom waited for her answer. Lucas, Daniel, her family, every guest. All eyes rested on Emma Whitmore, because the choice she made next would determine everything that came after. The silence inside the ballroom felt heavier than anything that had come before. Emma stood at the altar between two men who represented two completely different chapters of her life. Behind her sat hundreds of guests who had arrived expecting a beautiful wedding. Instead, they had witnessed the unraveling of a story that had been buried for 7 years. The officiant's question still hung in the air. Emma, do you still wish to continue this ceremony? Emma closed her eyes for a moment, not because she didn't know the answer, but because she knew how painful the answer would be. When she opened her eyes again, she turned slowly toward Daniel. For the first time since the ceremony began, the room disappeared. It was just the two of them standing there. Daniel Carter, the man who had offered her something she desperately needed when her life felt unstable. Peace, security, a future built on certainty. Emma spoke softly.
Daniel, you're a good man.
He didn't respond, but his gaze stayed steady. You gave me something I didn't think I'd ever have again, Emma continued.
Calm.
Safety.
A life that made sense.
Her voice trembled slightly now. For a long time, I convinced myself that was enough. Daniel's expression shifted slightly. Not anger, not disappointment, just understanding. Emma looked down briefly at the ring on her finger, the symbol of the life she had been preparing to begin. When we met, I was tired, she said quietly. Tired of chaos. Tired of uncertainty. Tired of feeling like everything could fall apart at any moment. She looked back up at him. And you gave me the opposite of that. Daniel nodded slowly. I know. Emma inhaled deeply. But today I realized something. Her voice grew steadier. I never healed from what happened. The guests listened in complete silence. Emma continued. I thought I had moved on. I thought I buried that part of my life. But standing here today, she glanced briefly toward Lucas. I realized I never truly faced it. Daniel followed her gaze but remained silent. Emma turned back to him. If I marry you right now, I wouldn't be doing it with a whole heart. The honesty in her voice was impossible to miss. You deserve someone who chooses you completely. Not someone who is still carrying pieces of the past. Daniel studied her for a long moment. Are you saying you still love him? Emma hesitated, then shook her head gently. That's not the question. She placed a hand lightly over her chest. The truth is, I don't even know who I am after everything that happened. Her fingers slowly moved to the ring on her hand. But I do know this. If I walk forward with this wedding today, I'd be lying to both of us. The room watched carefully as Emma slipped the ring off her finger. The small motion felt enormous. She held the ring for a second before placing it gently in Daniel's palm.
I'm sorry, she said quietly.
For bringing you into a story that wasn't finished yet.
Daniel looked down at the ring in his hand.
Then back at Emma. The wedding, carefully planned, meticulously organized, celebrated by so many, had just ended in the simplest possible way. Emma stepped back from the altar. The ceremony was over. Not because of anger, not because of betrayal, but because honesty had finally arrived. Lucas Hayes hadn't moved during any of it. He stood near the altar steps, the letter still loosely held in his hand. The moment Emma removed the ring, the room erupted into quiet whispers. Guests struggled to process what had just happened. But Lucas wasn't paying attention to them. He was looking at Emma. Because this wasn't the outcome he expected. Not even close. When he received her message weeks earlier, Lucas assumed the invitation meant one of two things. Either Emma wanted to apologize, or she wanted closure before moving on with her life. He never imagined she would stop the wedding entirely. Emma slowly turned toward him. For the first time since he arrived, they stood facing each other without the ceremony acting as a barrier between them. Lucas exhaled slowly. You didn't have to do that, he said. Emma looked confused. What do you mean? Lucas glanced briefly at Daniel, who still stood quietly at the altar. You don't owe me your future. The words were simple, but they carried years of emotion. Lucas continued. I didn't come here to take you away from him. I came because you asked me to bring the letter. He lifted the paper slightly. And because I needed to know the truth. Emma nodded. And now you do. Lucas looked down at the letter again. The pages felt heavier than they should. For years I believed you left because I failed. Emma shook her head gently. I never stopped believing in you. Lucas gave a small, bittersweet laugh. That might actually make it worse. Emma's expression softened. I'm sorry. Lucas studied her face for a moment. The same woman he once shared a tiny apartment with. The same woman who believed in his dreams when they were nothing more than ideas scribbled on notebooks. But also someone changed by time and loss. We can't go back, Lucas said quietly. Emma nodded. I know. The past had been explained. The truth had finally surfaced. But understanding something didn't automatically rebuild what had been lost. Lucas folded the letter carefully. For the first time in 7 years, its words had been spoken aloud. The mystery was gone. The anger was gone. Only reality remained. Lucas looked at Emma again. At least now we know what really happened. Emma exhaled slowly. Yes. For the first time in years, the silence between them wasn't filled with unanswered questions. It was simply quiet. And sometimes, quiet was enough. The story didn't end in the ballroom that afternoon. Life rarely ends at dramatic moments. Instead, it continues quietly afterward. In the days following the wedding that never happened, the story spread quickly through social circles and business networks. People talked about it in whispers, about the bride who stopped her own ceremony and the mysterious letter that changed everything. But Emma Whitmore stopped paying attention to the noise. For the first time in years, she made a decision that wasn't shaped by fear, expectations, or the pressure to appear perfect. She chose honesty. The weeks after the wedding were not easy. Calling off a marriage publicly meant dealing with uncomfortable conversations. Friends asked questions. Family members worried about her future. Some people tried to convince her she had made a mistake. But Emma never changed her answer. I did the only honest thing left to do. Daniel eventually reached out to her a few weeks later. Not with anger. Not with bitterness. Just quiet understanding. They met once to talk, closing the chapter between them respectfully. Daniel admitted that the wedding had revealed something important to him as well, that stability alone could never replace a fully healed heart. They wished each other well. And then they walked away. Emma also spent time alone confronting the memories she had buried for years. The pregnancy, the loss, the choices she had made in silence. For the first time, she allowed herself to grieve properly instead of pretending those parts of her life never existed. Slowly, the emotional weight she had carried for so long began to lighten. Lucas didn't disappear after the wedding, but he didn't rush toward her either. They understood something important now. Understanding the past didn't mean they had to recreate it, so their connection returned slowly. A message occasionally, a phone call once in a while. Two people rediscovering each other without the urgency or pressure that once defined their relationship. No expectations, no promises, just honesty. And strangely, that honesty made everything feel easier. Because for the first time since they met as university students, they were no longer chasing dreams or running from pain. They were simply two people who finally understood the truth of what had happened between them. 6 months later, Emma pushed open the door of a small cafe tucked along a quiet street. The place was nothing like the extravagant ballroom where her wedding had once been planned. No crystal chandeliers. No expensive decorations. Just warm lighting, the soft smell of coffee, and a handful of people quietly enjoying their afternoon. Lucas was already seated near the window. When Emma approached, he stood up and smiled. Not the excited, restless smile she remembered from their younger years. This one was calmer, more grounded. "Hey," he said. "Hey." She sat down across from him. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Not because the silence felt uncomfortable, but because it didn't. Lucas slid a cup of coffee across the table toward her. "I remembered how you like it." Emma smiled faintly. "You still remember that?" "Some things stick." They talked about simple things at first. Work, travel, books they had been reading. The conversation moved easily, like two people who had known each other for years, because they had. Eventually Lucas leaned back in his chair and looked at her thoughtfully. "It's strange," he said. "What is?" "For years I thought our story ended the night you left." Emma stirred her coffee slowly. "And now?" Lucas shrugged lightly. "Now it just feels unfinished in a different way." Emma smiled softly. "Maybe that's okay." Lucas nodded. Outside, the late afternoon sun filtered through the cafe window. For the first time in years, there were no misunderstandings between them. No hidden letters. No unanswered questions. Just truth. And sometimes, that was the strongest foundation two people could start with. Because sometimes the bravest thing you can do isn't choosing love. It's choosing the truth.